My mother is in the hospital. I came to work her shift, so she won't lose this job. The woman was 7 months pregnant, and she said it calmly, in a room full of armed men who had all risen to their feet at once, before a single raised hand turned every one of them to stone. She didn't know she had just walked through a door no one in Chicago dared to knock on. She didn't know who the man behind that walnut desk was. She only knew one thing. Her mother needed this job, and she was not leaving until the silver was polished. The whole room held its breath, waiting for Gideon Kane to give the order. This was a man who had never forgiven anyone for setting foot in his territory uninvited. But that morning, the most feared boss in Chicago looked at the stranger clutching a metal bucket, standing tall among men the whole city bowed to, and did something none of his men had witnessed in 11 years. What could make a man the entire city feared hold back his hand for a pregnant maid? And what secret was waiting for both of them at the end of that road? Stay with us until the very end, because this ending is nothing like the one you're imagining. If today's story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories still waiting to be told. Snow was still lashing diagonal streaks across the tall glass windows of the mansion on the shores of Lake Michigan, when the gun that had been drawn halfway was slipped back into its holster, swiftly and silently, as though the bodyguard himself wished to erase the moment when he had reacted more slowly than his employer's hand. No one in that room dared to breathe too loudly, because this morning had never been an ordinary morning. 3 nights earlier, the organization's largest shipment of the quarter had been intercepted by federal agents at Pier 9, the only pier that appeared on no official schedule. Only 6 people in the world knew that shipment existed, knew the hour, and knew the way in. All 6 of them were now standing around this walnut table, their eyes fixed on the map of the harbor, and one of them had betrayed them all. Gideon had summoned them before dawn, not to ask questions, but to let the traitor know that he was closing in. That was why the entire room felt as taut as a violin string about to snap. And it was also why the appearance of a pregnant woman carrying a metal bucket was something no one could possibly have imagined. But Gideon Kane didn't look at her as though she were a threat. In the instant his hand rose, his gray eyes had already registered 3 things that none of his men had noticed. The first was the ash-gray uniform she wore, loose across the shoulders and taken in with clumsy but sturdy hand-stitching, the kind of alteration made by someone who couldn't afford a new uniform but refused to look untidy. The second was the access badge hanging over her chest, its plastic yellowed by years of use, its corners worn smooth, and the small photograph printed on it, showing the face of a woman with salt and pepper hair who had bowed her head and cleaned this house for 11 years. And the third, the thing that made something inside his chest sink for a single beat, was the knock on the door. 1 knock, exactly 1, neat and soft, followed by the opening of the door. In this entire mansion, only 1 person knocked on the reading room door that way. The only person permitted to work in this room while he was there, moving quietly, like a shadow through all those years. Mrs. Pearl Whitlock. The young woman standing before him carried Pearl's habit in her fingertips, wore Pearl's badge over her heart, and held her chin with the same quiet refusal to bow that he had seen in her mother whenever someone spoke to her in a condescending tone. Later, after everything was over, people finally pieced together how she had managed to walk so deeply into the most heavily guarded place in Chicago. The elderly housekeeper stationed at the staff entrance had recognized that face at first glance, because a photograph of Mrs. Pearl's only daughter had been taped to the inside of her locker door for years, and the young woman herself had waited for her mother at that same gate on several winter afternoons. A familiar face, a genuine badge, and a morning when the entire mansion had been thrown into chaos by an emergency meeting. Those 3 things together had opened a door that gunfire never could. No one had found the time to tell her that today, the reading room was no longer the reading room she knew. And now she stood there, surrounded by 6 powerful men and 1 hidden traitor, doing the only thing she had come there to do. Cora set the bucket beside the display cabinet, with a careful motion that made no sound, spread a soft felt cloth across the side table, then began arranging each piece of silverware in an order of almost uncanny precision, knives first, spoons afterward, the large tray last, following every step exactly as someone meticulous had taught her. Someone who believed that doing even 1 small task properly was another way of preserving one's dignity. Her hands were slightly cracked from the cold, but they didn't tremble. The entire room watched her work in absolute silence. 6 men who had once decided the fate of whole neighborhoods now standing motionless before a woman polishing a silver spoon. Gideon watched her for a long while before he finally spoke, his voice low and steady, never needing to rise because it never had. He told everyone to leave and said the meeting would continue that afternoon. The 6 men departed more quickly than they had arrived, and one of them must have breathed a sigh of relief at escaping those gray eyes for a few more hours. When the door closed, Gideon did something even he couldn't explain. He drew a chair from the corner of the room, placed it near the side table, sat down until his eyes were level with the woman at work, and asked whether she had eaten breakfast. The question was so simple that it seemed out of place in a room still haunted by the gunpowder scent of suspicion. Cora looked up at him for 1 second, her eyes neither frightened nor hastily grateful, then answered that she still had 17 pieces of silverware to polish first. She lowered her gaze and returned to her work, as though the man all of Chicago feared were merely a guest who happened to be sitting nearby. Gideon said nothing more. But when Frank Doyle, the older advisor with silver hair, returned to close the door, he caught the young boss's gaze turning slowly from the woman toward him, followed by a nearly imperceptible nod. Frank had served the Kane family long enough to understand that unspoken command. Find out who this woman is, everything about her, in absolute silence, and don't let her know. The 17th piece of silver had been polished by the time the snow beyond the window had thinned into sparse, slowly drifting flakes. Cora folded the felt cloth into exactly 4 folds, returned each piece to the display cabinet in its original order, and only then allowed herself to straighten her back and rest one hand against her hip to support the weight of the baby in her womb. Gideon had left his chair at some point and was standing by the window with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking a few brief words she couldn't make out. When he turned back, he merely said that a car was waiting in the courtyard and that it was time for her to be with her mother properly, not through a bucket and 17 pieces of silver. Cora meant to refuse. She meant to say she could take the bus, just as she had on the way there. But there was something in this man's voice that made refusal seem unnecessary, not because it carried a threat, but because it left no room for bargaining. The black car moved almost soundlessly along the snow-covered road beside the lake, and throughout the journey, they hardly spoke at all. There was only the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers and the warmth rising from the leather seat, the kind of seat Cora had never once occupied in her life. Northwestern Hospital received them with the smell of antiseptic and long, brightly lit corridors. In a room in the cardiology ward, Pearl Whitlock lay propped against a stack of pillows, an oxygen tube curved beneath her nose, her face gray after so many years of overwork that her body had only now begun to admit. She opened her eyes and saw her daughter, and the smile just beginning to form on her lips froze the instant she recognized the man standing behind her. She tried to push herself upright, and the monitor beside the bed cried out in protest as apologies began pouring from her in a breathless rush. She said she hadn't known the girl would do something so foolish, that Cora had never listened to her, that he mustn't blame her, and that every fault was hers. Cora stepped forward and placed herself between the hospital bed and the man behind her, her back as straight as it had been that morning when she stood in a room filled with weapons. In a clear, unwavering voice, she said that no one there was at fault, that she hadn't gone to the mansion to beg for anything for herself, and that she had asked for only one thing, that her mother's name not be removed from the employee list, because in 11 years, Pearl had never missed a single shift until her heart itself had gone on strike. The room fell silent for a moment. Gideon looked at the pregnant woman standing between him and her mother like a fragile yet unyielding wall. And then he did something that left both women stunned. He pulled the plastic chair away from the wall, placed it beside the bed, sat down, and told Pearl that her job would remain exactly where it was, that her full wages would continue to be paid every week until she recovered, and that no one in that house would be permitted to touch her position. Pearl stammered and asked why. She said she was only a cleaner, and replacing her would be as easy as changing a light bulb. Gideon remained silent for a long while before answering, and when he did, his voice dropped into a register Cora had never heard from him before. He said that there was a room in that house whose door no one in the entire city dared to knock upon. But once, on a night when he needed it more than anything else in the world, one person had dared. He said he was the kind of man who never forgot a debt, even when that debt was no larger than a plate of hot soup. He said nothing more, and Pearl stared at him with wide eyes, as though she had only just realized that the young master still remembered something she herself had believed no one else did. Yet it wasn't the promise of her job or the old debt that finally broke something open inside her. It happened when Gideon rose to leave, bowed his head to her, and said, "Please rest and get well, Mrs. Pearl." That was all. Mrs. Pearl. Her name, spoken fully and with respect by the head of the household where, for 11 years, she had been called the cleaning woman, the maid, or, more often than anything else, nothing at all, as though she were merely part of the walls. Her thin shoulders began to tremble, and tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, not the tears of someone who had narrowly escaped disaster, but those of someone who had just discovered that after all those years of working with her, head bowed in silence, someone had still seen her as a human being with a name. Cora took her mother's hand, and in that moment, she looked at the man standing in the doorway with different eyes, no longer with the wary gaze she had worn that morning. Gideon gave the two women a slight nod and stepped into the hallway. And just then, a young nurse passing by stopped and hesitantly called into the room that a man had come to the reception desk earlier and asked for Mrs. Whitlock's room number, but when she turned back to ask his name and his relationship to the patient, he had already disappeared, leaving behind only the closing elevator doors and a trail of melted snow across the floor. Cora felt her mother's hand stiffen slightly inside her own. Out in the hallway, Gideon Kane stood perfectly still for one more second, his gray eyes darkening like the surface of the lake before a storm. Then he took out his phone and dialed a familiar number. 2 days after that morning at the hospital, when the snowbanks along the roads had begun turning gray with the dust of passing cars, Frank Doyle entered the reading room with a thick gray envelope tucked beneath his arm, something he didn't place on the walnut table until he had carefully closed the door behind him. Gideon asked no questions. He opened the envelope and allowed Cora Whitlock's life to unfold before him, one cold page at a time, written in the language of official records, a language that knew neither mercy nor embellishment. The first page was a transcript from a nursing school on the south side of the city. Her grades had remained among the highest in her class for 4 consecutive semesters, accompanied by an instructor's observation that she possessed an unusually precise memory and remarkably steady hands in the clinical practice room. Then the record ended abruptly, with a line stating that she had withdrawn before completing the program because of personal circumstances, dated nearly 8 months earlier. The second page was a statement from a savings account that had grown little by little over 4 years, through small, regular deposits made by someone who knew how to go without, only to be emptied in a single afternoon by the account's joint owner, a man named Wade Mercer. The pages that followed revealed that he had abandoned their shared apartment exactly 1 week later, without leaving a forwarding address. Attached to them was a copy of a loan agreement taken out by that same man, a loan for which he had cleverly persuaded Cora to sign as guarantor, leaving the debt on the shoulders of a pregnant woman, while the man who had spent the money vanished like smoke. In the lower corner of the agreement, where the lender's information appeared, one line of fine print passed almost unnoticed among all the other administrative details. Authorized debt collection agent, A. Renner, followed by an address on the south side. Frank turned the final 2 pages for him. Personnel records from a diner and a small hotel. Both listed the reasons for termination in polished phrases such as workforce restructuring and failure to meet job requirements. Yet the dismissal dates from both establishments fell during the weeks when anyone with eyes could see that her pregnancy was no longer something she could conceal. Gideon read everything slowly, overlooking not a single page, then returned each document to the envelope in precisely the same order. He offered no words of pity, didn't sigh, and didn't shake his head, because he understood, in the way of someone who had once stood very straight through a childhood no one knew about, that people like Cora Whitlock didn't need anyone to feel sorry for them. They needed only the one thing this entire city had been too miserly to give, a chance that didn't come with the gaze of someone expecting gratitude for an act of charity. He looked up at Frank and said simply that the mansion's linen storeroom and laundry records had been without a manager since the previous employee left, that the work required no heavy lifting and no bending over, only a mind capable of keeping things in order and a pair of eyes that missed no detail. From what Frank had just brought him, it appeared that the most suitable candidate was already living beneath this roof. Frank studied his young employer for 1 second longer than necessary, with the gaze of a man who had served this family for 2 generations and had never seen anyone given a place in quite this way. Then he nodded and said he would take care of it. Everything would pass through the personnel office as an ordinary hire, and no one needed to know that the instruction had come from the highest floor. And so, while Mrs. Pearl continued counting the days of her recovery in a hospital bed, her daughter began spending her mornings in the ground floor storeroom of the mansion, surrounded by the clean scent of fresh linens, tall shelves stacked with folded sheets, and record books that, Within only a few days, she had arranged more neatly than her predecessor ever had. She was closer to her mother, earning an honest wage, and no longer required to bow her head before anyone. She didn't ask why this job had found her, and no one offered an explanation. But one small thing began happening with such regularity that it could no longer be called coincidence. Every morning, when Cora opened the storeroom door, a warm cup of decaf coffee was waiting on the corner of the wooden desk where she kept the records. The only kind of coffee a pregnant woman was permitted to drink, prepared exactly right, and placed neatly upon a saucer. She asked the head cook, who shook her head. She asked the kitchen assistant, who merely shrugged. She asked the elderly steward at the gate, and he only smiled and said that this house occasionally practiced courtesies that required no signature. Cora stood in the warmth of the storeroom, both hands wrapped around the steaming cup, and looked through the small window toward the silent row of tall glass doors on the mansion's highest floor. For the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to think that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still one corner of the world that hadn't learned how to turn its back on people like her and her mother. In the days that followed, Cora gradually discovered something strange about that vast house that had once seemed so cold, that on its ground floor there was a world entirely different from the solemn silence of the upper levels, a world filled with the smell of toasted bread and the sound of knives against cutting boards, where the head cook called her by the affectionate name only her mother had ever used, where the kitchen boy knew she liked ginger tea in the afternoon even though she had never told him, and where the elderly butler could recite every detail of how she had once stood at the top of her nursing class as though he had attended her first day of school himself. As it turned out, through all those years, during the late shift meals in that kitchen, Mrs. Pearl had spoken of her daughter so often that everyone below stairs knew Cora's story by heart, and now that Cora had truly entered the house, she understood that she had never been a stranger there. She had been living inside her mother's proud stories, long before she ever passed through the gates. On Saturday afternoon, when Cora visited her mother at the hospital carrying a box of ginger tea and the good news that the doctors said her heart was recovering well, Mrs. Pearl listened as her daughter told her about the new job, the linen room, and even the mysterious cup of coffee no one would admit to leaving. Then she fell silent for a long while, her gaze drifting toward the window where the winter afternoon was fading, and she began to tell a story she hadn't shared with anyone in 11 years. It was about the night the former master died, young Gideon's father, a man whom, she said, could make the entire mansion hold its breath with nothing more than the sound of his shoes in the hallway. The news reached the estate late that night, and the young heir, who was only 26 at the time, walked straight into the reading room and closed the door behind him. The entire organization arrived and filled the corridor, the most hardened and dangerous men in the city standing there for hours as they waited for the heir's first command, but not one of them dared raise a hand and knock on that wooden door. Not one. Mrs. Pearl was only a night shift cleaner then, and her working hours had already ended, but she went down to the kitchen, warmed a plate of soup, carried it upstairs, walked through the crowd of men standing like statues, knocked once, and stepped inside. She said the young master was sitting motionless behind the large desk, not crying, not speaking, only sitting very straight in the darkness like a child trying to pretend he wasn't there, and she placed the soup in front of him and said only one thing: eat first, then become the master, and afterward she walked out. Cora asked whether she had been afraid. The entire city feared that family, and the hallway that night had been filled with armed men who hadn't dared knock on the door. Mrs. Pearl turned to look at her daughter, her aged eyes suddenly softening, and spoke the words Cora knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. People were afraid of him, but all I saw was a child no one had ever cooked a meal for. Throughout the bus ride home that afternoon, Cora sat silently beside the fogged window, thinking about the gray-eyed man who had pulled out a chair and sat level with her in the most powerful room in Chicago, merely to ask whether she had eaten breakfast, thinking about the way he had bowed his head beside the hospital bed of a cleaning woman, and she realized that she was beginning to see what her mother had seen 11 years earlier. Not a crime lord, but a human being who had been imprisoned inside his own name for far too long. The following morning, when she carried the laundry records upstairs according to schedule, Cora paused outside the reading room, whose door had been left slightly open because the early shift cleaner was still working inside, and she did one small thing she had spent the entire night considering. She took a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Inside were several lines thanking him for the job and for the cup of coffee that appeared every morning, even though no one would admit to leaving it. and at the very bottom was another sentence written in the trembling, slanted hand of a sick woman, which Mrs. Pearl had asked her daughter to deliver. "Young master, you should leave that room more often." Cora slipped the note beneath the stone paperweight on the desk and went downstairs without waiting to see what would happen. Late that afternoon, Gideon returned after a long day, saw the note, opened it beneath the desk lamp, read it once, then read it again, and the corner of his face, so unaccustomed to revealing anything, shifted faintly at the mouth, a movement so small that even he didn't notice it. He didn't throw the note into the wastebasket as he did with every other piece of paper once he had finished reading it. He folded it into a tiny square, took the leather wallet from his coat pocket, and tucked it into the innermost compartment behind his driver's license, where people kept the things they never intended anyone else to see. That same evening, nearly halfway across the city from the lakeside mansion, inside a dimly lit bar in the south side where cigarette smoke had stained the ceiling yellow, a hand wearing a gold ring pushed a stack of money across the greasy wooden counter, and a rough voice rose from the shadows, speaking in the tone of a man accustomed to buying every answer he wanted. "Find out who the pregnant woman living in the Kane house is." That week, Cora's routine prenatal appointment fell on one of those rare, clear mornings in the middle of winter, and by a coincidence no one in the mansion believed was truly a coincidence. The driver, who usually took members of the household staff on errands, was suddenly given the day off. Gideon appeared in the downstairs foyer with a ring of keys in his hand, and said in a deliberately casual voice that he had business near the clinic anyway, so he might as well take her since it was on his way. An explanation so clumsy that the head cook had to turn toward the soup pot to hide her smile, while the elderly butler suddenly became deeply absorbed in polishing a door frame that was already spotless. Cora sat in the back seat as proper manners required, but halfway there, the man behind the wheel quietly remarked that with her sitting back there, he really did look like a chauffeur, so she moved into the front seat, and the two of them spent most of the remaining drive in silence. Though it was the kind of silence neither of them wished to break. The maternity clinic occupied a warm red brick building, and when the receptionist asked whether the person accompanying her would be joining her in the ultrasound room, Cora hadn't even had time to answer before Gideon followed her through the door, as naturally as though it were something he did every month. The small room was dimmed, the gray monitor flickered to life, and the older doctor spread a layer of warm gel across Cora's rounded belly before guiding the probe slowly over it, and then the sound came, filling the entire room. A quick and steady rhythm like the hooves of a small horse racing across an open field, the heartbeat of the baby. Cora had heard that sound once before, alone in a crowded public clinic, but this time she heard it with a man standing beside her, who had gone so still he seemed nailed to the floor. Gideon Kane, the man who could raise one hand and freeze an entire room of armed men, the man whose words could decide the fate of a whole harbor, stood there staring at the gray screen where a tiny form lay curled inside her, and he couldn't speak. His hand at his side closed gently into a fist, and then opened again, as though he were searching for something to hold on to in the middle of something far too immense, and in those gray eyes the entire city compared to polished steel. There was a light no one had ever been allowed to see. The doctor studied the steady heartbeat on the monitor, then turned toward them with a smile and asked kindly whether he was the baby's father, so she could print an extra ultrasound photograph for him to keep. The room fell silent. Gideon didn't answer. He didn't nod or shake his head. He simply stood there looking at the screen, and Cora, after a moment that seemed to last an entire winter, didn't correct the doctor either. The doctor looked from one of them to the other, then quietly printed 2 photographs instead of 1. On the way back to the car, neither of them mentioned what had happened, but Gideon placed the ultrasound picture inside the breast pocket of his coat with both hands, and when he opened the car door for Cora, across the street, somewhere among the passing crowd, a small flash of light appeared and vanished like sunlight striking glass, so quickly that Cora only frowned for a moment before telling herself she must have imagined it. The story of that trip reached the mansion before the car did, moving in the way all stories move through a large house, passing through the kitchen, the laundry room, and the corridors, and by the end of the week, there wasn't a single person in the house who hadn't heard the tale of the crime lord and the maid, whispered in countless versions, each one carrying some added detail that had never happened. Frank Doyle was the one who brought the matter to the reading room, speaking with the same blunt honesty with which he had served 2 generations of the Kane family, and he told Gideon that the whispers were no longer contained within the house, that they had already crept into the streets. And in their world, Rumors of a new weakness belonging to Gideon Kane were a valuable commodity. He asked whether the rumors should be silenced, beginning inside the mansion. Gideon stood at the window, looking down at the frozen lake streaked with patches of sunlight, and remained quiet for a long time before answering that nothing would be silenced. Instead, from that day forward, every expense, every work arrangement, and everything connected to Cora Whitlock inside the house would be recorded clearly in the books. Her wages would pass through human resources. Her position would have a formal job description. There would be no exceptions, and not a single payment would take an indirect route. When Frank raised an eyebrow at such an unexpected order, Gideon turned back toward him and spoke the words the old advisor would remember and repeat many times in the years that followed. When there is nothing to hide, there is nothing to distort. Frank looked at the young man he had watched grow up among safes and secrets, and suddenly realized that, for the first time in the history of the Kane household, a master of that family had chosen to defend himself with honesty instead of fear, and he didn't know whether he should be relieved or deeply afraid of what that choice might bring. On Wednesday afternoon, Cora asked permission to leave the linen room earlier than usual so she could stop by the supermarket and buy a few things to prepare for her mother's return to the hospital, and under a quiet rule she didn't know had existed since the day of the prenatal appointment, 2 men from the mansion followed her at a distance, far enough away that she wouldn't feel watched. Dusk had already begun to settle when she pushed her shopping cart into the parking lot, her breath turning to mist before her face, and she was bending down to arrange the bags when a voice sounded behind her, the voice she had spent 8 months trying to forget, calling her by the private name only one person had ever used. Cora turned and saw Wade Mercer standing there, thinner than she remembered, wearing an expensive coat that didn't match his worn shoes, with the same smile that had once made her believe even his most impossible promises. He said, "Look at you. Who would have thought we'd meet again like this?" His voice as sweet as though there had never been an afternoon when he emptied 4 years of her savings and disappeared without leaving a single message. Cora stepped back, one hand resting on the edge of the cart, and said in a calm, cold voice that there was nothing left for them to discuss, that everything he had wanted to say was already sitting inside the empty bank account he had left behind. Wade laughed and moved closer, saying she had changed, that she hadn't known how to speak like that before. Then his eyes slid down to the curve of her belly, and something calculating flashed inside them. He said he had heard she was living well now, staying in a lakeside mansion, and asked what she had done in there to climb so high so quickly. She turned to leave, and he reached out and caught the sleeve of her coat, only the sleeve, but before a single blink had passed, 2 figures from the row of cars beside them were standing close on either side of him, silent, not touching him, simply present with the weight of 2 slabs of stone, and Wade released her sleeve as quickly as though he had touched a hot stove. He stepped back and raised both hands to chest level, the smile still fixed on his face but changed now, becoming the smile of a gambler who had just seen the largest game of his life. He said, all right, let's talk like civilized people," then pulled a white business card from his coat pocket and placed it on the edge of her cart. He said it belonged to his lawyer, told her to keep it, and added that what stood between them was now an adult matter, and adults handled their affairs through documents. Then he turned and walked across the parking lot, whistling an old tune he used to whistle whenever he won at cards. Cora stood motionless as the parking lot darkened around her, staring at the business card bearing the name of a law office she had never heard of, and feeling the winter cold seep through her coat in a way entirely different from the way it had 10 minutes earlier. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at the mansion by registered mail. Inside was a letter written in the smooth language of attorneys, stating that their client, as a man with a direct connection to the unborn child, was considering several legal actions, as well as sharing with the press certain information he possessed regarding the private affairs of a prominent family. However, the letter continued, their client would be willing to reconsider everything if he received a sufficiently generous good faith payment to begin a new life somewhere far away. The amount was written out carefully in words on the final line, a sum large enough to buy the entire block where he had been born. It was extortion, pressed flat and folded neatly inside legal language, and everyone in the mansion's conference room understood that before they had finished the first paragraph. That afternoon, around the walnut table, the organization's most trusted men sat waiting in a particular kind of silence. The silence of men who already believed they knew what the order would be, because in their world, dealing with a parasite bold enough to crawl onto the Kane family's dining table had never required more than 1 phone call and 1 moonless night. Even Frank Doyle, who had watched his young employer choose integrity over fear, sat with his back straight and waited, because he knew there were certain lines the traditions of this house had never allowed anyone to cross and remain whole. Gideon stood beside the window for a very long time, the letter lying open on the table behind him, while outside, the gray lake slowly swallowed the final light of day, and when he turned around, the entire room held its breath, waiting for a name and a nod. But he looked at each face in turn, slowly, then said that if he dealt with that man in the way his father once would have, he would be teaching the unborn child that this was exactly how the world was meant to work. No one in the room moved. He walked to the table, folded the letter along its original creases, and issued his orders in the voice of a man directing a transfer of power rather than an act of revenge. Every letter, the business card, and every written account of the encounter in the parking lot would be copied into a complete file. One copy would go to the family's legal office. Another would be sent directly to the city's financial crimes division, accompanied by a formal complaint for attempted extortion. Every step would follow the law, every seal would be placed where it belonged, and no one in the house was permitted to come within a single step of Wade Mercer. The meeting ended in a silence difficult to name, the men leaving the room one by one with the faces of people who had just witnessed something without precedent. Some saw vision in it, others saw a fracture, and at the far end of the ground-floor corridor, beyond the reach of the lights, a middle-aged man who had served the house since the days of the former master slowly drew a second telephone from the inner pocket of his coat, entered a number saved under no name at all, raised the phone to his ear, and when someone answered at the other end, he spoke only one sentence. "The young master has just spared a South Side debtor, exactly as you predicted." Wade Mercer's attempt at extortion dissolved as quickly as snow falling onto a lake that hadn't yet frozen. Only a few days after the complaint file was submitted, the law office named on the white business card quietly announced that it would no longer represent its client, because no sane attorney wanted his name attached to a demand for money already sitting on the desk of the Financial Crimes Division, and inside the lakeside mansion, people began to believe the trouble had ended. But it hadn't ended. It had only changed its clothes. Exactly 1 week later, another set of documents was formally served, this time not a demand for money but a petition stamped by the family court, in which Wade Mercer requested legal recognition as the father of the child Cora Whitlock was carrying, along with the right to participate in every decision concerning the child from the moment the baby was born. And attached to it was a thick bundle of exhibits explaining the grounds for the request, claiming that the mother was living in an environment described through carefully chosen words as containing criminal elements and being unsuitable for raising a child, and that the court needed to intervene to protect the baby's interests from those influences. Ruth Calloway received the case through the nonprofit legal aid organization she had worked with for many years, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose, and a reputation that made fellow attorneys straighten their ties before entering any courtroom in which she appeared. And during her first meeting with Cora in the organization's small office, she spread the exhibits across the table like a hand of cards that needed to be read backward. There were photographs among them, and when Cora saw them, she understood that the small flash she had noticed across the street on the morning of her prenatal appointment hadn't been her imagination. The photographs, taken from a distance, showed her leaving the mansion gates, climbing into the black car, and standing beside the gray-eyed man as he opened the door for her, all of them arranged and captioned to create the portrait of a woman who had entered the world of a family the entire city treated with caution. Cora sat silently before the stolen images of her own life, while Ruth removed her glasses, cleaned them slowly, then explained what had troubled her from the very first page. She had read hundreds of case files from fathers who sincerely wanted to reclaim a place in their children's lives, and every one of those files had been filled with questions about the child, the expected delivery date, the condition of the pregnancy, the hospital, the doctor, but this file contained nothing of the kind. There wasn't a single line asking when the baby would be born, not one line asking whether the mother and child were healthy. Instead, nearly every request for information pointed in an entirely different direction, demanding clarification of the mother's income, disclosure of all payments from the Kane family, a list of assets, financial flows, and business entities connected to the place where the mother lived and worked. Ruth tapped one finger against the stack of papers and said plainly that a small-time gambler who had just lost his lawyer over a clumsy extortion letter couldn't possibly have drafted a petition this sophisticated on his own. This document had been written by another hand, a far more expensive one, And the real question wasn't what Wade wanted, but who was standing behind Wade and what that person wanted. The answer arrived that same evening from a direction no one had expected, when Frank Doyle placed on the reading room desk the results of several quiet weeks spent tracing the man who had approached the hospital reception desk asking about Mrs. Pearl's room, then disappeared before anyone could ask his name. Everyone in the mansion, including Cora, had privately assumed that the man was Wade, sniffing his way all the way to a hospital bed, but the hallway surveillance footage Frank obtained showed an entirely different face. A thick-necked, broad-shouldered man known throughout the Southside business world as Aldous Renner's favorite debt collector, the man who led the lending and gambling network that controlled half the southern part of the city. The pieces immediately slid into place with a precision cold enough to raise the hair on the back of the neck. The collector hadn't gone to the hospital looking for Mrs. Pearl. He had gone there tracing the relatives of Wade Mercer, a debtor who had disappeared, and during the course of collecting an insignificant debt, one of Renner's men had discovered something worth 10,000 times more, that the woman Wade had abandoned was now living beneath the cane roof, close to the heart of an empire Renner had spent years trying to see inside. According to Frank's sources, Wade's Southside debt had recently been erased, not because he had paid it, but because he had become a useful piece on the board, and the expensive law firm behind the family court petition was being paid through a chain of companies that, once followed back through several layers, eventually reached Renner's name. Gideon stood looking at the image taken from the hospital camera for a long time, and he understood the entire game with the clarity of a man who had been trained to play such games. The petition had never been aimed at the baby. It had never even truly been aimed at Cora. It was a drill wrapped in court documents, boring through a pregnant woman to reach the thing Renner wanted most: the Kane family's records, cash flows, and asset structures, things no spy could ever steal, but a court-ordered demand for evidence might expose. Very late that night, the light in the ground-floor laundry room was still burning, and Cora sat alone among the shelves of white linen, the copied petition resting across her lap, the secret photographs of her life stacked beside her, while the dryer turned steadily in the background like a mechanical heartbeat inside the sleeping house. She didn't cry. She had survived enough to know that tears couldn't change a single page. She simply sat there for a long time, then lowered her eyes to the curve of her belly and placed both hands over it, as though shielding a small flame from the wind, and whispered in a voice meant only for herself and her child that you are the one thing I have never ruined, and I swear to you, this time I won't let anyone ruin it. The light from the laundry room spilled through the crack beneath the door and into the dark hallway, and Gideon noticed it as he crossed the ground floor at an hour when no one in the house should still have been awake. He had intended to keep walking. He had spent the entire evening in the reading room, with the image taken from the hospital camera and the layers of companies leading back to the South Side, had seen the entire game laid out before him, and precisely because he saw it so clearly, he had come to understand a truth more bitter than any extortion letter, that Renner's drill could pierce through that woman only because she was standing close to him, that every stolen photograph held value only because the Kane gates appeared inside it, and that the most powerful weapon his enemy held wasn't a lawyer or money, but the name Gideon Kane itself. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, and Cora looked up from where she sat among the shelves of white linen, the file still resting across her lap, her eyes dry with the resolve of someone who had decided she wouldn't cry. Neither of them offered a greeting. The steady turning of the dryer filled the silence for a long while. Then Gideon pulled over a wooden chair and sat an arm's length away from her, looking at the secret photographs spread across the folding table, and spoke in a low voice she had never heard from him before. Not the voice of command, not the voice of protection, but the voice of a man removing the bricks from his own walls with his bare hands. He told her to listen until he had finished, and afterward she could answer however she wished. He said those photographs existed because the gates of his house appeared in them, that the petition could stand before a court because his name appeared inside it, and that if she left this house and moved with her mother to another city, with every expense already provided and nothing ever expected in return, then the words criminal environment in those papers would dissolve into nothing, and the person behind Wade would lose any reason to pursue a mother who no longer had any connection to the Kane family. Then he said the words he had never spoken to anyone in his life, slowly and clearly, one word at a time, that if his disappearance from her life would help her keep her child, he would open the gates with his own hands and let her leave. Only the sound of the dryer remained in the room. Cora looked at the man the entire city believed incapable of bowing his head. now sitting on an old wooden chair in the laundry room and offering to erase himself from her life as though he were nothing more than an ink stain, and she suddenly understood, with the instinct of someone who had been abandoned too many times, that those words had cost him more strength than any command he had ever given. She closed the file, placed it beside her, and when she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. She told him that he had finished speaking, and now it was her turn. The father of her child had left when she needed someone to stay more than ever. Her mother's own parents had abandoned her when she was still young. 2 employers had abandoned Cora the moment they saw the curve of her belly. Her entire life had been filled with people leaving her behind, and she had passed through enough doors closing at her back to know one thing: she didn't intend to become like them. She said she was staying, not because she had nowhere else to go. For the first time in her life, another road lay open before her, complete and waiting, and she was still choosing not to move. She was staying because her mother had found a place in this house where people called her by her name, because her child wouldn't grow up learning that the moment a storm came, you abandoned the boat, and because she believed in what her mother had seen behind the reading room door 11 years earlier. Gideon said nothing. There are moments when words can only make smaller the things growing quietly in the silence. His hand, resting on the folding table between them, moved slightly and settled over hers. He didn't tighten his grip or pull her closer. He simply left his hand there, warmth passing into warmth. 2 people who had learned to stand upright alone now standing upright beside one another, while the dryer turned steadily like the breathing of the house, and beyond the small window, snow began to fall again. The telephone in Gideon's coat pocket vibrated at that exact moment, its screen glowing inside the dim room, revealing a message from Frank Doyle, brief and cold as a blade laid upon the table. I found something connected to Pier 9. Don't trust anyone in the house. Frank Doyle's message hung over the mansion throughout the days that followed like a cloud refusing to rain. Gideon summoned no one, changed no schedule, and revealed no sign that he knew there was a leak inside his own house, because he had been taught since childhood that if you wanted to catch a rat, you didn't move the cabinet, but beneath that calm surface, every door in the mansion had begun to be viewed through different eyes. And the leak continued to flow. The latest proof lay inside the supplemental exhibits Wade's attorneys submitted to the court, which Ruth Calloway forwarded with one sentence underlined twice, because the documents contained details no photographer standing outside on the street could possibly have known: the exact date and time of Cora's next prenatal appointment, the name of the clinic, even the fact that the driver had been given that day off, information that existed only inside the mansion's private work schedule, which meant the person selling secrets wasn't standing beyond the gates. That person ate in the same kitchen and walked the same hallways with them every day. That evening, in the reading room, when Gideon placed the supplemental exhibits on the desk and told Cora the truth he no longer wanted to keep from her, that even her prenatal schedule had been passed outside, she didn't panic as he had prepared himself for her to do. She remained silent for a moment, then asked for a sheet of paper and a pen. What happened next made even Gideon sit straighter in his chair. Cora closed her eyes, and with the same memory that had once prompted her nursing instructor to write a special note in her academic record, the kind of memory trained never to confuse a dosage and never to forget an injection time, she began reciting every small fragment she had unconsciously filed away during the past several weeks. Who had asked her what, where they had asked it, and at what time of day. The gardener had once asked about her mother's health in the rear courtyard one afternoon, an ordinary question from a decent man. The kitchen boy had once asked when she planned to begin maternity leave, in front of everyone in the kitchen, an ordinary question from someone who cared. But there was one person, the harbor manager who entered the mansion every week for meetings, who had asked her questions on 3 separate occasions that seemed harmless when considered alone, but revealed their shape when placed side by side. The first time, in a ground-floor hallway one morning, he had casually remarked that the master seemed to be driving himself more often lately, and asked where he had been going so regularly. The second time, near the linen room one afternoon, he had asked which clinic she used for prenatal care so his wife could consider it, though Cora later learned that his wife had been beyond childbearing age for years. The third time, only the week before, in the passage behind the kitchen, he had asked how the driver's schedule had changed since her arrival. She wrote all 3 incidents down, with approximate dates and locations accurate to the exact section of hallway, pushed the paper across the desk, and said she wasn't accusing anyone. She was certain of only one thing, that her memory had never betrayed her. Gideon looked at the page, at the name rising from 3 questions that had once seemed insignificant, one of the 6 men who had stood around the harbor map on the first morning she entered this room, and for the first time since Pier 9 had fallen, the prey had cast a shadow. But fate intended to test that woman one more time. At noon the following day, while riding back from the hospital after visiting her mother, the car stopped at a traffic light near the Old Market District, and Cora happened to glance through the window and saw something that seemed to stop the blood inside her body. Frank Doyle, the silver-haired advisor Gideon trusted like a father, was stepping out of a small restaurant whose windows were clouded with steam, and directly behind him, holding the door open, was the thick-necked, broad-shouldered man Cora had seen in the image taken from the hospital camera. Aldous Renner's trusted debt collector. The 2 men paused on the sidewalk to exchange several more words, standing close like old acquaintances, then separated in opposite directions, and the car carrying Cora rolled through the intersection with a woman sitting motionless inside it, her heart pounding violently. Throughout the rest of the drive and the entire afternoon in the linen room, she weighed the same choice again and again, a choice as heavy as stone. To speak meant placing an accusation on the table against Gideon's most trusted man, the very man who had warned him not to trust anyone in the house, though perhaps that message itself had been another move in the game. To remain silent meant carrying a burning coal inside her chest and allowing Gideon to keep walking among shadows, without knowing which one stretched longest directly behind him. She thought of her mother, of the baby, and of the hand that had rested over hers in the laundry room. And when the mansion lights came on and the hallways had grown empty, Cora Whitlock climbed to the highest floor, stood before the oak door of the reading room, drew one deep breath, and knocked. Once. Only once. The door opened, and Cora told him everything, without circling the subject, without softening the beginning, exactly as she had entered this room the first time. She told him about the intersection in the Old Market District, about the small restaurant with windows clouded by steam, about the silver-haired advisor and the thick-necked, broad-shouldered debt collector standing close together like men who knew each other. And when she had finished, she added one more thing, that she understood how heavy these words were, and she asked only that he not question whether she was certain, because she wouldn't be standing there if she weren't. Gideon listened from beginning to end without interrupting, and not one line of his face changed. But Cora had been close to this man long enough to recognize that such perfect stillness was the shape his storms took. He thanked her with a slow nod, told her to go and rest, and when the door closed behind her, he remained alone in the room for a very long time, standing before 2 things that couldn't both be true, the message warning him not to trust anyone in the house, and the fact that the man who had sent it had just been seen with one of the enemy's men. The following morning, Frank Doyle was asked to come to the reading room, and he knew immediately that something was wrong when he found only the 2 of them inside. No tea, no documents, only the young master standing behind the walnut desk with something lying face down beneath his palm. Gideon offered no greeting. He turned the object over and pushed it across the desk, a photograph hastily printed from a Market District security camera that his men had obtained during the night. The angle was uneven, but the image was clear enough. The silver-haired advisor and the Southside debt collector standing outside the restaurant, and Gideon asked only one question, brief as the click of a lock. "Explain this." The air in the room thickened like the sky before a storm, the kind of silence that, in their world, usually came before only 2 things, a confession or a sentence. Frank looked at the photograph, then at the man he had held in his arms when he was still red-faced and newly born, and what appeared across the old man's face wasn't fear, but a vast and weary sadness. He said the young master was right, that he had met with Renner's man 3 times during the past 2 weeks, and if Gideon wanted to hear why, then he would explain on the honor of a man who had served this house through 2 generations of masters. Since the night Pier 9 fell, he had known there was a traitor inside the house. He had warned Gideon not to trust anyone, but Frank himself couldn't trust anyone enough to help investigate. He hadn't dared use any of the household men, hadn't dared speak even to Gideon through any channel that might be overheard. So he had done the only thing men of his generation knew how to do. He had entered the den himself, pretended to be a disgruntled servant willing to sell information, and bought drinks for Renner's debt collector so he could draw the truth out of their side and learn who inside the Kane house was selling secrets. Then he added, slowly, that he no longer knew which walls in this house had ears, so he had chosen to let Gideon suspect him, rather than allow the enemy to know it was being hunted. After that, he drew a worn leather notebook from the inside pocket of his coat and placed it beside the photograph. Inside were notes written in the slanted hand of an old-fashioned man, the date and time of every meeting with the Southside collector, every sentence the man had let slip after his third drink, and on the final page, underlined twice, were the words the debt collector had boasted while drunk, that our man inside the cane house has been drawing 2 salaries since before that pregnant girl ever appeared, ever since your master turned down Mr. Renner's money. Gideon stood silently before the notebook, and the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place with the heavy sound of a lock opening. He called Cora upstairs, placed the page containing her 3 seemingly insignificant questions beside Frank's notebook and the photograph from the hospital, and the 3 of them, a crime lord, an advisor from another era, and a woman with the trained memory of a nurse, looked down at the single name rising from all 3 directions: the harbor manager, one of the 6 men who had stood around the map on that first morning, the only person who had known the Pier 9 schedule, and whose behavior also matched every fragment Cora remembered. His motive, it turned out, had taken root before she ever entered the mansion, from the day Renner's people proposed an alliance that would divide control of the southern harbor routes, and Gideon refused without hesitation. The harbor manager had grieved over that lost profit so bitterly that he opened a back door for himself, and when the pregnant woman arrived at the mansion, when the master began driving a maid to prenatal appointments himself, the man became convinced his employer's time was over, and so he grew bolder with every move, even selling the appointment schedule of an expectant mother to win favor with a new master. The entire room waited for the order, and Frank, obeying the instincts of 50 years, quietly asked whether Gideon wanted the matter handled inside the house or down at the harbor. But Gideon studied the name on the paper for a long time, then said no, not inside the house, not at the harbor, not in the old way. If the man wanted to live by selling information, then information would decide the course of his life. The entire notebook, the photograph, Cora's written account, and every piece of evidence connected to Pier 9 would be handed to the federal agents investigating the shipment, complete and unaltered, without a single page withheld. Frank stared at him and asked whether he understood what he was saying, because turning over the Pier 9 file to the federal government meant placing the Kane family's own records on their table. Gideon nodded and said he understood it better than anyone, and that was precisely why the meeting with the federal authorities wouldn't be limited to one trader. He would sit at that table himself, because he had a larger proposal to make, one that, if accepted, would change this house down to its foundations. Frank asked what kind of proposal. Gideon looked out through the glass at the gray lake and answered that when the papers were signed, Frank would be the first to know. On the night before the hearing, a snowstorm swept into the city from the lake, as though winter had come to reclaim everything it had temporarily spared. The wind struck in violent bursts that rattled the mansion's tall windows. The streetlights along the lakeshore were reduced to blurred halos behind the white curtain of snow, and in the reading room, Gideon sat before the files already arranged for the following day, for the hearing, for the meeting with the federal authorities. Every piece on the board had been placed. All that remained was to wait for daylight. Then the first telephone rang. Frank Doyle's voice came through with more urgency than Gideon had heard in all the man's 50 years of service, reporting that Renner's people were pouring into the southern harbor district in organized numbers. They had chosen the storm, the one night when snow blinded every watching eye. They were striking directly at the main warehouses, and unless the master's orders and presence reached the harbor within the next hour, the shipping routes built by 3 generations of the Kane family would belong to someone else before dawn. Gideon surged to his feet, and at the exact moment his hand closed around the ring of keys, the second telephone rang. The number belonged to the room on the ground floor, and when he answered, what he heard wasn't speech but breathing. Cora's breathing, coming in short, hurried bursts, before her voice rose between them, strangely calm despite the strain, telling him that the baby couldn't wait until the expected date. The child wanted to come tonight. Through the other telephone, Frank was still calling Gideon's name, reciting warehouse numbers and the cost of every passing minute. Both worlds of Gideon Kane called to him in the same second. On one side stood an empire built through 3 generations of steel and iron. On the other was the breathing of the woman he had never told he loved. He chose, within a single breath. His thumb pressed the red button, and Frank's call vanished from the screen like a lamp blown out by the wind. The telephone was left face down on the walnut desk among the files of an empire, continuing to vibrate again and again inside an empty room where no one remained to hear it. Those who witnessed what followed would later say they had never seen their master move that way. He descended the stairs 4 steps at a time, personally helped Cora into the car with the hospital bag, The head cook had thoughtfully prepared the week before and took the driver's seat himself, because on a night like this, he wouldn't place the wheel in anyone else's hands. The car plunged into the storm, and beyond the windshield, the world became nothing but a swirling field of white. The wipers struck at full speed and still couldn't keep pace with the sky. Oncoming headlights appeared and disappeared like ghosts, and the man who commanded an entire city through brief orders now gripped the wheel with both hands, his back soaked with sweat despite the cold inside the car, facing for the first time in his life something he couldn't command, couldn't purchase, couldn't threaten, and could only endure beside someone else. Then, from the back seat, the strangest part of that night began. Cora's voice rose, not frightened, not pleading, but steady and composed, like the voice of an instructor guiding someone through a difficult shift. She told him to listen to her, that she knew what her body was doing, that the contractions were still far enough apart, that they had time, and that he didn't need to run red lights or drive faster than the road could safely allow. The woman in labor in the back seat was calming the man behind the wheel. She breathed in for 4 counts and out for 6, counting aloud so he could hear the steadiness of her rhythm. And between contractions, drawing from the memory of years spent riding buses across the city to school and work, she told him to leave the Lakeshore Avenue where the crosswinds were strongest. She guided him toward a road running between 2 rows of tall buildings that blocked the wind, where the snow fell straight down instead of lashing sideways, where the tires could hold the pavement more securely. She told him she knew this neighborhood, that she had once studied nearby, and that after the next row of lights, he should turn right and they would reach a main road that had already been salted. Gideon followed every instruction. The man who had never obeyed anyone now answered each of her directions like a student, and in the rearview mirror, their eyes met between contractions. She even managed a small smile and told him that, as he could see, her 2 years of nursing school hadn't been a complete waste of money. A sound escaped him that was almost laughter, something so unfamiliar that even he didn't recognize it, and then he spoke into the white road ahead, telling her to keep breathing exactly as she was, and he would take care of the road. They would divide the night between them. The car moved through the snow-covered city like a needle passing through heavy cloth, slowly but without stopping, steadily but without recklessness. From the back seat came the measured counting of 4 breaths in and 6 breaths out, as regular as the turning of a washing machine in some warm room hidden inside memory. In the front seat, his broad shoulders leaned forward, shielding the entire windshield before him. Far away in the southern part of the city, inside the abandoned reading room, the telephone lying face down continued to glow and fade, carrying reports that one warehouse after another was changing hands, that a great portion of an empire was being lost in the storm, reports the only man with the authority to decide had chosen not to hear. Then, after the final turn Cora had drawn from memory, the snow ahead suddenly began to thin, and through it, the red and white lights of Northwestern Hospital's emergency entrance appeared, glowing with the warmth of a hearth in the middle of a frozen field. The 2 large glass doors were already open. Figures in white were pushing a wheelchair all the way to the edge of the covered entrance, and Gideon Kane turned the wheel beneath the canopy and brought the car to a stop as gently as though he were lowering a child into a cradle. As the streetlights beyond the hospital windows began to fade beneath the silver-gray light of a new day, the first cry of a baby girl rang through the delivery room at Northwestern Hospital, full, strong, and loud enough to make one of the midwives laugh and say that few babies announce their arrival to an entire floor so clearly. The little girl came safely and completely into the world beneath the careful hands of people dressed in white, every reading as beautiful as a morning in June. And they dried her, wrapped her in a soft, cream-colored blanket, then placed her against the chest of the mother who had crossed a long night through the strength of her own breathing. Cora looked down at the tiny face moving its lips against her chest, at the damp silk of hair, at the small fingers loosely curled like unopened buds, and everything she had carried through the past 8 months, the debt that had never belonged to her, the stolen photographs, the thick court petition, suddenly receded like the sound of a storm silenced beyond the glass. All that remained was this unbelievably warm weight against her body, real, breathing, and hers. The midwife asked whether the mother had chosen a name, and without taking her eyes from her daughter's face, Cora answered without a moment of hesitation that the baby's name was June. She explained that her mother had been born in June, during the most beautiful season of the year, and that she wanted her daughter to grow up carrying the name of the woman who had taught her mother that honest work was never beneath anyone, that no matter where life placed you, if you did your part with dignity, then no one stood lower than anyone else. The midwife wrote the name on the tiny band fastened around the baby's wrist, June Whitlock, and outside, the winter sun was truly rising, spreading a pale pink glow across the snow-covered rooftops. In the hallway outside the nursery, meanwhile, there was a sight the nurses working that morning would tell one another about for a long time afterward. A tall man in a black wool coat, still dusted with snow, stood motionless before the nursery's broad glass window, and no one knew how long he had been there. The two hands that had signed documents capable of silencing an entire harbor now hung uselessly at his sides, with nowhere to go. It was Gideon Kane, a man some people in the city would rather walk 3 blocks out of their way than encounter, and that man didn't dare step through a thin glass door. He only stood outside, staring at the transparent crib where a tiny new life had just been wheeled in to sleep, staring as though one step closer might allow the world he carried on his shoulders, the harbors, the names, the old debts of his bloodline, to follow him into that spotless white room and stain it. He had brought them through the storm, but at this threshold, the most powerful man in Chicago believed he had no right to enter. Cora saw him through the glass as they pushed her bed along the hallway, saw him standing alone like a load-bearing pillar that didn't know it had been given permission to rest, and she asked the nurse to stop. She opened the nursery door slightly and called out in a tired but clear voice that he should come in, because the baby ought to know the face of the man who had brought her there. Gideon turned and looked at her for 1 second, then another, as though waiting for her to take the invitation back. And then he pushed open the door and entered. He walked toward the crib with steps impossibly gentle for a man of his size, and bent down to look at June sleeping, her small face peaceful and rosy beneath the warm light. No one heard what he said. They only saw him remain beside the crib for a long time, with his head bowed, one hand resting on its edge as carefully as though touching the most fragile thing in the world, and the broad shoulders that had carried an empire trembled once, only once, before straightening again. Much later, after June had fallen deeply asleep in the room beside her mother, and dawn had spread fully across the white city, Gideon stepped into the hallway, sat down on the row of waiting chairs, and for the first time since the night before, turned his telephone over. The screen was crowded with missed calls and messages from Frank Doyle, arranged in time like reports from a battlefield. Warehouse 1 was lost. Warehouse 2 was lost. Renner's men had raised their flag over the main crane. The southern harbor route had effectively changed hands. The final message, sent near dawn, contained only one sentence. "We've lost the harbor, young master." A nurse walking past later said she saw the man in the black wool coat stare at the telephone for a long time, then do something that made her turn around and look again, because she couldn't believe her eyes. He smiled, a slow, restrained, strangely peaceful smile. The smile of a man who had just learned that he had lost everything in a great game, yet looked as though every piece had landed on exactly the square where he had intended it to be. The hearing was postponed for several days for a reason that made even the judge raise an eyebrow when reading the motion. The mother in the case had just given birth, and when the appointed day finally arrived, Chicago was unusually clear, with thin winter sunlight spread across the stone steps of the family courthouse. Cora entered the courtroom wearing a simple wool dress, her face still carrying the weariness of a woman who had recently given birth, but her back was as straight as it had been every other time she had stood before something larger than herself. Beside her walked Ruth Calloway, carrying an old leather briefcase filled with the only weapon she trusted: documents. Baby June, meanwhile, was half a city away that morning, sleeping peacefully in a small apartment warm with the smell of baked bread, cradled in the arms of her grandmother Pearl, who had recovered well enough to claim the privilege of caring for her granddaughter. Pearl sat beside a sunlit window, softly singing an old melody and telling the sleeping child to rest, because her mother was taking care of all the noise outside, and her mother was very good at it. Across the aisle in the courtroom, Wade Mercer sat in a borrowed suit that didn't fit his shoulders, beside a new attorney whose eyes kept drifting toward the rear of the room, where 2 men in plain clothes sat as still as statues, agents whom anyone observant could tell hadn't come because of an ordinary family case. Ruth Calloway didn't begin with emotion. She began with a stack of papers, drawing out each page like a carpenter pulling nails, slowly, firmly, without missing once. The bank records showed that from the day Cora Whitlock became pregnant, the man claiming to be the father in the petition had never sent a single dollar, had never attended one medical appointment, and had disappeared from their shared apartment during the very week when the woman needed someone beside her most. The clinic records confirmed that among all the relatives who had contacted the office during the 8 months of pregnancy, the name Wade Mercer hadn't appeared even once. Then Ruth reached the final blow, the thing she had recognized during her first meeting with Cora. She placed before the court every request for disclosure filed by the plaintiff throughout the case and invited the judge to count with her. There were 17 requests concerning income, assets, financial flows, and business entities connected to the place where the mother lived. As for the number of requests concerning the expected delivery date, the baby's health, or the hospital where the child would be born, Ruth paused, looked around the courtroom, then said, "Your Honor, that number is none. Not one line. This father doesn't even know that his child was born last week, and I respectfully ask the court to call this file what it truly is. This isn't the petition of a father searching for his child. It is a tool for extracting information disguised as a family court action." The courtroom fell silent. The judge removed his glasses and looked toward the plaintiff's table, and Wade's attorney rose awkwardly to request a private conference with his client. But at that exact moment, something happened that no one in the room had expected. Wade Mercer, who had spent the entire hearing shrinking beneath the weight of the documents and the eyes of the two plainclothes men at the rear of the courtroom, and who understood better than anyone that another case involving attempted extortion was waiting for him after this one, suddenly brushed aside his own attorney's hand, sprang to his feet, and spoke loudly across the room. "Wait. I want to speak. I want to cooperate." It was as though all the air had been drawn from the courtroom. He began talking rapidly, his voice breaking like that of a gambler who had lost his final dollar. He said the petition wasn't his, that the signature belonged to him, but he hadn't even read every sentence, that someone had erased his enormous debt in the South Side in exchange for allowing his name to be used, that someone else had paid the expensive law firm because he could never have afforded it himself, and the name that burst from his mouth dropped into the courtroom like a stone striking a frozen lake: Aldous Renner. The judge had to strike the gavel twice before order returned. The two men in plain clothes at the back of the courtroom were already standing, one holding a telephone to his ear, and Ruth Calloway, amid the confusion, merely gathered her papers and arranged them neatly, like a craftsman who had just driven the final nail. The ruling was issued that same day. The plaintiff's petition was dismissed in full because it hadn't been brought to protect the child's interests. Every right belonging to the mother remained intact, while the statements Wade had made in open court were entered into the record and immediately forwarded to investigators, where he would trade them for leniency in his own extortion case. Cora remained seated for a long moment after the sound of the gavel, as though she needed more time to believe that the document pressing against her chest for weeks had finally crumbled into dust. Then she turned toward the benches behind her, where Gideon sat 2 rows away, close enough for her to know he was there, yet far enough that no one in the courtroom had any reason to linger on the sight of them, and he gave her a slight nod, nothing more. That afternoon, in an office overlooking the South Side, Aldous Renner received 3 telephone calls in quick succession. The first informed him that the petition had been dismissed. The second reported that Wade, his useful pawn, had confessed everything, and was now in police custody, eagerly serving as a witness. The third came from Renner's most expensive attorney, whose trembling voice reported that federal agents had just arrived at the law office carrying a stack of warrants, and that apparently, sir, every trail they believed had been erased was already lying neatly arranged on the agent's table, prepared in advance by someone else. Renner lowered the telephone and looked through the window toward the southern harbor cranes, still flying his banners, toward the warehouses he had seized during the storm, and a cold unlike anything he had ever known crept slowly along his spine as he finally understood, later than everyone else, that on the night he believed he had won everything, the man across the city hadn't even bothered to answer the call to save the harbor, and now Renner was beginning to understand why. What Aldous Renner had only begun to understand that afternoon became known in full throughout the city over the weeks that followed, when the news reports started calling it the largest coordinated operation against the South Side in 20 years. The meeting between Gideon Kane and the federal authorities, the meeting he had once told Frank would be revealed to him first once the papers were signed, had taken place before the night of the storm, inside an unmarked office in the heart of downtown. And what Gideon placed on the table that day wasn't merely Frank's leather notebook or the name of the harbor manager who had betrayed him. Gideon placed before them a proposal that left even the most seasoned agents sitting in silence for a moment. He would surrender everything: the Pier 9 records, the identity of the informant, and every piece of evidence showing that he had sold information to the South Side, the layers of companies leading from the expensive law office back to Renner's money. And above all, he would surrender the darkness within his own family's legacy, the undocumented shipping routes, and the double books that 3 generations of the Kane family had kept hidden behind steel. In return, there would be a supervised withdrawal agreement. The Kane family would leave every illegal operation according to a timetable, verified step by step, surrender what had to be surrendered, preserve only the legitimate businesses, and no one in the house, Gideon included, would receive immunity if even a single page were concealed. That was why, on the night of the snowstorm, he had been able to end Frank's call without looking back, because the southern harbor, the heart of the Empire's darkest side, had already been included in the transfer plan, marked, recorded, and watched at every entrance and exit by federal eyes waiting for the day they would take control. When Renner's men stormed in that night and raised their banners over the cranes, they hadn't seized a prize. They had marched themselves straight into a crime scene already covered by cameras, personally delivering proof of organized seizure into the hands of the very people who needed it to complete their case. Gideon's smile in the newborn ward that morning had been the smile of a man who had calculated even that move. Losing a harbor he had already decided to abandon, so his enemy would lock his own hands around it. Everything that followed unfolded with the cold precision of a machine wound to its final turn. Wade Mercer's testimony connected the law office to Renner's money. Frank's notebook connected the harbor manager to the men buying information. The files Gideon surrendered joined every piece into a circle without a single gap, and unmarked vehicles began stopping one after another outside disguised gambling rooms, lending offices, and Southside warehouses, until one morning in early spring, Aldous Renner himself emerged from his office building between 2 lines of federal agents. The man who had once believed the law was nothing more than a low fence meant for the poor was now bound tightly by every clause of that very law, stripped of his network, his money, and even the name that had made people afraid, the final and only possession men like him ever truly owned. In the reading room of the lakeside mansion, when Frank Doyle laid the newspaper carrying the report on the walnut desk and quietly asked whether Gideon wished to say anything about it, Gideon stood beside the window looking out at the lake, where the ice had begun to melt. He remained silent for a moment, then said that his father had taught him to bury his enemies, but his daughter had taught him something else: to let the system his enemy despised bury him instead. Frank didn't ask when the young master had begun calling the baby my daughter. There are things a man hears and answers only with a slight bow of the head. But that victory wasn't a miracle without loss, and Gideon never lied to himself about that. The cost was written plainly across the pages of the agreement he had signed with an unwavering hand. The largest harbor, the pride of 3 generations of his family, now belonged to the Port Authority. The old shipping routes were permanently closed. Nearly half the Empire's value disappeared through divestments and penalties. Names that had once feared the Kane family now shrugged and called him a man who had broken off his own fangs. And in the hidden rooms of the old world, more than a few people who had once lived from the generosity of this house quietly turned away. He accepted every loss the way a person accepts a scar after the surgery that saved his life, without complaint and without looking back, because every afternoon when he returned to the mansion and passed the linen room on the ground floor, he heard something no harbor in the world could ever replace: the soft voice of a woman singing a lullaby, and the clear, gentle sounds of a tiny life learning how to greet the world, inside a house that was learning once again how to become a home. That spring, when the ice on Lake Michigan had completely melted and the cranes at the old harbor began working beneath the new colors of the Port Authority, the Kane family entered the greatest transformation in its 3-generation history. And that transformation was nowhere near as smooth as the news reports made it sound. Gideon poured everything remaining of the empire into businesses that could stand openly beneath the sun. A legitimate commercial transportation network whose books told only one story, rental properties in the downtown district, and a chain of restaurants that had once served merely as fronts, but were now being developed into real and profitable enterprises. He sat through one long meeting after another in the reading room, where men who had followed the house for decades took turns saying what they truly thought. One declared bluntly that the master was turning wolves into house dogs. Another, more restrained, asked how the men were supposed to make a living when the pie had been cut in half. The quietest among them was the one who simply didn't return the following day. Gideon allowed them to leave. He didn't stop them, didn't threaten them, and asked only one thing: that anyone walking away from this house must do so with clean hands, because every page of the old books now rested inside someone else's vault. There were evenings when he remained alone until very late, surrounded by the growing number of empty chairs around the walnut table, and the only person who was always still there, standing near the window with a cup of tea gone cold, was Frank Doyle. The silver-haired advisor had remained silent throughout the entire season of transition, so silent that Gideon couldn't tell which side of the new road he had chosen, until one afternoon near the end of spring, after the final divestment agreement had been signed and the courier had just left, Frank slowly approached the desk and placed a heavy metal object on the wood. The sound of it landing made Gideon look up. It was the ring of keys to the underground vaults beneath the mansion, the vaults for which Frank had been the only keeper outside the bloodline for 50 years. They were empty now and had no reason to exist, and Frank spoke in the voice of a man laying down a burden he had carried for more than half his life. "I followed your father because I was afraid. I follow you for something else." Then he stood upright, for the first time in 50 years, not in the posture of a man awaiting orders, but as a man remaining because he had chosen to stay. Gideon looked at the keys resting inside the streak of afternoon sunlight across the desk and understood that he had just received something 3 generations of wealth had never been able to purchase. Meanwhile, in the other half of the house, another rebuilding was taking place, quieter but no less determined. Cora returned to nursing school as soon as June was strong enough, completing the semesters she had been forced to abandon through evening classes. And on those nights, the ground floor linen room remained lit until late. The young woman sat among shelves of white towels with her textbooks open before her, a highlighter tucked behind one ear, sometimes reading a passage about care after surgery aloud to herself, and on certain evenings, without anyone ever saying a word, a steaming cup of ginger tea would appear on the corner of her desk at the exact moment she needed it most. In the same way, this house had always preserved its unsigned acts of kindness. On the day she received her diploma, 3 people in the front row applauded more loudly than anyone else. An elderly, silver-haired woman with tears shining in her eyes, a tall man in a black wool coat, clapping with the awkwardness of someone still learning how to show what he felt, and a baby girl only a few months old, sitting in her grandmother's arms, babbling along with the applause without understanding why everyone was smiling. It was also Cora, with the scent of fresh ink still clinging to her diploma, who proposed the creation of a healthcare fund for every member of the family's household staff, and Gideon approved it immediately, so that no cleaner would ever again have to work until her own heart finally refused to continue, as her mother's once had. Mrs. Pearl was now fully recovered. The doctors said her heart had healed better than they had expected, and she still came to the mansion every morning just as she had for the past 11 years, except that now she entered through the main gate instead of the staff entrance, carrying no cleaning bucket, and pushing a baby carriage instead. Because this house now had one duty, she declared, she would surrender to no one, caring for her granddaughter. And so the ground floor kitchen, the warmest heart of the house, gained a tiny queen of its own. Every morning, June sat in a high chair at the center of the kitchen, babbling commands over her kingdom in a language only she understood. The head cook mashed steamed apples for her and declared her the most demanding guest she had ever served. The kitchen boy performed every ridiculous trick he knew in exchange for one burst of delighted laughter. The elderly butler abandoned his habit of reading the morning newspaper so he could compete for the privilege of carrying her around the garden. More than once, the household staff witnessed their master, the man who had once frozen an entire room merely by raising one hand, standing patiently in line behind the head cook and the butler, waiting for his turn to hold June. And when that turn finally came, the face that had once seemed as cold as steel softened in a way no one from his former world could ever have believed without seeing it with their own eyes. 1 year later, on a spring day when Lake Michigan had turned blue again, and the grass along the shore had grown thick enough to cushion small feet, a checkered blanket was spread beneath the old oak tree in the garden overlooking the water, and gathered upon that blanket was an entire family, in a sense no document could ever define. Mrs. Pearl sat leaning against the tree trunk, peeling an orange one section at a time. Cora sat arranging the basket of bread. Frank Doyle stood several steps away, pretending to admire the lake, though his eyes never left the baby. And June, exactly 1 year old, wearing a yellow dress that made her look like a patch of sunlight learning to walk, was holding onto the edge of a wicker basket as she practiced standing. Then the moment came without warning, as all miracles do. June released the basket, swayed once, and took 1 step, then 2, then 3 unsteady steps across the grass, while the entire garden held its breath. What made Mrs. Pearl raise a hand to her mouth and made Cora laugh through suddenly wet eyes was the direction of those first steps. The little girl didn't walk toward her mother. She didn't walk toward her grandmother. She headed straight for the tall man sitting at the edge of the blanket, the man who had once made an entire city avoid meeting his eyes, and who now froze as though nothing in the world had ever bewildered him so completely. Then he lowered himself fully onto one knee in the grass, opened both arms, and June tumbled into them with a bright burst of laughter that carried across the lake. Gideon lifted her into the air and turned once beneath the sunlight, and when Cora came closer, he reached out with his free hand and took hers, the hand whose ring finger now carried an antique ring set with a vivid blue stone, the only ring his mother had left behind. He had kept it for years in the deepest compartment of an empty vault, because he had never believed the day would come when he would find someone worthy of it, and he had finally given it away on a quiet winter evening they both chose to keep for themselves. There had been no party and no announcement, only one question and one answer in a kitchen still warm with the scent of apple pie. Not long after that picnic, Northwestern Hospital welcomed a new nurse for her first shift, and when Cora Whitlock walked through the glass doors in a true white uniform, with a brand new name badge fastened neatly to her chest, she paused for a moment in the maternity ward hallway. It was the same stretch of corridor through which she had been wheeled on a hospital bed more than a year earlier, the same place where the nursery window stood, before which a man had once remained motionless because he hadn't believed he had the right to enter. Cora smiled at the woman reflected in the glass, the woman who had once been dismissed from 2 jobs because of the curve of her belly, who had once sat alone in the middle of the night with a court file resting in her lap, and who now stood there with 2 carefully trained hands ready to help other lives enter the world. She walked along that hallway as though she were walking through her own life, and began her first shift. Back at the lakeside mansion, on one perfectly ordinary afternoon, sunlight slanted through the tall glass doors of the reading room and laid long bands across the wooden floor. Gideon sat behind the walnut desk, signing the final documents of a business that was now honest down to every seal, and the oak door of the room, the door that no one in Chicago had once dared to knock upon, stood wide open. For a long time now, the house had followed a new rule that no one had formally announced, but everyone knew by heart. The reading room door was never closed again. From the hallway below came June's delighted laughter as her grandmother chased her through the sunlight, followed by the head cook calling upstairs that the bread was nearly ready. Gideon set down his pen and raised his eyes toward the only object hanging on the wall behind his desk. It wasn't an award. It wasn't a photograph of ships. It was a small wooden frame containing a yellowed piece of paper, pressed flat beneath the glass, bearing a trembling line of slanted handwriting, written by a hand that had once rested weakly upon a hospital bed. "Young master, you should leave that room more often." He looked at those words for a long while, and the corner of his mouth curved into a smile that was no longer rare upon his face. Then he stood, left the stack of documents untouched on the desk, and walked out of the room toward the sound of laughter. Because in the end, this story was never about a powerful man rescuing a poor woman. It was the opposite. It was the story of people who possessed nothing but dignity and kindness, rescuing a man who seemed to possess everything. A person isn't saved by power or money, but by the moment when someone looks through the fear and the name and sees a human being beneath them. And no one, not even a crime lord born among vaults and shadows, must be defined by his past forever, so long as one day there is a knock, courageous enough to sound against the door, and someone inside courageous enough to open it. If today's story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the warm and moving stories still to come.